Top of the morning to you. Thank you for joining us for Sunday Bible class. Being up bright and early, we get to start the day off right, opening up the Word of God together. That is a treat indeed. I know we have quite a few of our kiddos, big kiddos missing today, but we have a good Bible class number. Hello, everyone. Great to see you. No doubt about that. Beautiful sunshiny day. I think lots of melting we have in store. Sounds terrific. We're in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 almost. We're going to be starting a new section today, but before we quite get into that, I have just a little bit that I need to finish up that we didn't have time to, one of our previous studies, and I put it off till today. And the reason for that is we've been talking about Hezekiah, and we're winding up his reign. Actually, we've already read about how he passes away and all that good stuff, and his son takes over. But I ask you to look with me in chapter 32 of 2 Chronicles. Chapter 32. I'm going to give you a heads up as you're going to, if you're not there already, 2 Chronicles 32, that we're going to leave this section. We're going to go back to the 2 Kings part. But as the heads up, if you want to mark this, we're going to be coming back to chapter 33, but we're not going to get into that just immediately. That will be later. So if you want to go ahead and be prepared to mark that, just if you don't want to have to find it a second time. 2 Chronicles 32, let's wind up old Hezekiah. Verse 27. Actually, verse 24, excuse me. In those days, Hezekiah was sick and near death. We've discussed this. Let's just remind ourselves. Why is Hezekiah near death in his sickness? What's going on in his body? Anybody remember that? That's okay if not. It's been a couple of times ago. No, but it's kind of close. It's a that he has on his body. Some sort of malignant boil, and obviously probably an infection within him. This really hit home with me. I haven't forgotten his age. You know why? 39. That's right. That's sad. I said that's too early. It can happen to anybody, right? And it happens with this guy. He's 39 years young, and God sends a messenger, very well-known prophet, 66 chapters in his prophetic work, Isaiah, the messianic prophet. He sends him to the king, and he says, look, you need to set your house in order because you're going to die. You're recovering from this problem that you have in your body. So, Hezekiah, though, smart guy. And we're told in verse 24, when he was sick and near death, he prayed to the Lord. In the king's version of this, he turns to the wall as he's lying on his bed, probably in privacy for this moment of intimacy with his God. And he makes a request for his life to be spared. And the reasoning he uses to plead with the Lord, he says, God, I ask you, please remember my years of devotion and service to you. Remember, Hezekiah has been a tremendous king. The comparison that's made, he walked in the ways of the Lord his God like whom else? David. And there's no other statement that's quite made like that. You know, at times you'll find like David, but with an exception. There's no exceptions with this guy. So he's a man after God's own heart, it appears, just like the Lord's servant David was. Hezekiah is sick. He's near death. He prays to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him. Isaiah he's been dispatched by God to give this prophecy. Set your house in order. You're going to die. Surely you will not live. And he turns around and he leaves. And he's passing through the 3 courts. Remember the divine number. The 3 courts of the temple. He goes into the first one, but before he can get into the second one, the word of the Lord comes back to him. And what's God's message tell him to do? Isaiah, you don't have your steps in today. I'm helping you out with your exercise. I want you to go march yourself right back upstairs. Really? Couldn't you told me this before? Well, timing's important to God, right? Timing has to be perfect all the time. He says, go back up and tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and I have seen what? I have seen your tears. Surely, he says, I will add 15 years, pretty good chunk, 15 years to your life. And he mentions, I'll deliver you out of the hand of Sennacherib and the mess in which you find yourself and the besiegement that's taking place in Jerusalem. He spoke to him and he gave him a sign. What was the sign that God provided to Hezekiah by which he may know? And I don't think this is a real compliment. I could be off on this. But I'm not sure that this is a compliment to Hezekiah. When this message from the prophet is delivered to him, he says, well, how do I know this is going to happen? Maybe a lack of faith on his part. Nevertheless, God acquiesces, and he gives him what sign? He says, I'll let you choose. Do you want this or do you want this? Okay. So the ancient clock is the sundial. Still works perfectly, by the way, today. And he says, the steps on the sundial of your father, Ahaz's clock, would you like those to go backward, or would you want them to go forward 10 degrees? It's unclear exactly, steps, not degrees. Well, okay, so some translations will read that way, and it's unclear as far as, it doesn't appear that those are probably hour increments, half hour, 15 minutes, something like that. But whatever it is, do you want it to go 10 steps? Some versions do read degrees forward, or do you want it to go backward? And Hezekiah's response to this is, well, that's an easy thing to make it go forward, really? You ever tried to fast forward time? When you're a kid and you're waiting for the biggest birthday party of your life and it's 10 hours away and it feels like it's 10 years? Were you able to fast forward time? You can't do that. I'm not sure what he means by, it's easy to fast forward time if you want. Let's rewind time. But I would agree that would seem to be maybe more complex of the two. And can you imagine watching the hands on a clock, no one touching it, and just going back this direction? That's crazy. God does this for Hezekiah. If the Lord would listen to your request when you have no hope, the doctors say, listen, you're on your way out, the last rites are being read to you, and you pray to God, and God sends a messenger of his to tell you, listen, I know what's taking place here. I care. I see your tears. Don't worry about it. I'm going to add a decade and a half to your life, and you're like, well, I just don't know that that's going to happen. Can I really trust you? That's sad if we think that way, but can I really trust you, God? And he says, well, let me perform a miracle so you know that. Just watch the hands on the clock. You want them to go forward or backward? I kind of prefer backward. All right. How would that make you feel? I think it makes Hezekiah feel really important also. Honestly, maybe a little too important about himself. God even gave him a sign by which he could know that divine favor was upon him. But, verse 25, Hezekiah, we haven't discussed this yet, Hezekiah did not repay according to the favor shown him, for his heart was lifted up. Why would that be the case? Maybe because God has been so generous to him, has listened to him, has answered his request, probably even gone above and beyond what Hezekiah would have expected. And he shows this marvelous sign not only to Hezekiah, but as well to everyone in the land, because everybody understands the way that the celestial bodies work. And they start going backward, everybody notices it. Therefore, wrath was looming over him and over Judah and Jerusalem because he did not show God the proper gratitude for the excellent kindness that the Lord had bestowed on him. However, credit Hezekiah, verse 26. Then the king humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. Now, we could look at this and we could say, well, why would God speak of this man in such glowing terms? Because he's so generous toward him, and then he doesn't show him proper thanks for all that God has blessed him with. How can he be seen as a man after God's own heart? Okay, let's reconsider. How was David seen as a man after God's own heart? David is guilty of arguably a number of the most egregious errors that you're going to find in Scripture that resulted in the loss of so many lives, thousands upon thousands upon thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of lives, he's responsible for just because of his selfish sins. How is that a man after God's own heart? Justin, every time he sins against the Lord, And sometimes he doesn't need it, but at other times he does need it to be pointed out to him. But every time it's pointed out, he turns back to the Lord. He admits his mistakes. His heart hurts because of the sins he's committed against God. How could this man be a man like David, after God's own heart, when he doesn't show the thanks to God for this ultimate kindness paid to him? Verse 26, Hezekiah humbled himself. And you'll find this time and again with this king. He's not perfect. He's a human being. But he changes whenever God corrects him. He and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. Verse 27, Hezekiah had very great riches and honor. He made himself treasuries for silver, gold, precious stones, spices, shields, all kinds of desirable items. Let's pause right there for just a moment. I know we've done this quite a bit, but it's been a while. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17. This is about 500 years before the kingship even, actually more than that, even comes into place. But Deuteronomy 17, in verse 14, God advertises to the people, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, oh, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Only, verse 17, he shall not, at the end of the verse, 17, acquire for himself, notice the terminology, excessive silver and gold. Not for himself. It's okay for the country, but not for himself. Excessive, tremendous silver and gold. All right, so go back to our passage, 2 Chronicles 32. Let's reread verse 27. Hezekiah personally had very great, you know what another word for this you could plug in there might be? Say it again. Immense, excessive. Hezekiah personally had immense, excessive riches and honor. And he made himself, sound familiar? Treasuries for silver, for gold, for precious stones, for spices, for shields, and for all kinds of desirable items. It's a direct violation of the command that God had given to the kings, and as Joe's pointed out to us a few times, so glad you're back. As Joe has stated for us, how is he to know that he's not to do these things? The king. There you go. So if we were to continue reading through Deuteronomy 17, I didn't. We've done it enough times to save it. I knew Joe would be able to fill in the details for us. We stopped in verse 17 of Deuteronomy 17, but he goes on to say, every king, Joe, is to handwrite his own copy of the law, and it's not like a lifetime achievement once you've done that, although that would be quite impressive. What's he to do with it then? Yeah, probably because you have to listen, you have to see, and you have to get hands-on. Yeah, he's pretty sharp, isn't he? Turns out. He kind of knows how the human mind operates a little bit for some reason. Yeah. So he's to keep it beside him, and he's to read it every day, the command was, of his life. And we're also finding in Deuteronomy 17 that his heart is not lifted up above that of his brethren, to think the law doesn't apply to him like it does to everybody else. He's to lead by example. He doesn't. He violates this command specifically for the kings of Israel and Judah. He made for himself, verse 28, storehouses for harvest of grain, wine, and oil, and stalls for all kinds of livestock, folds for flocks. And remember for whom he does this. Verse 27, this is for himself. 29, moreover, he provided cities for whom? For himself, and possessions of flocks and herds in abundance, for God had given him very much property. The same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of the upper Gihon, a stream surrounding Jerusalem that passes through it. more of a brook almost. And he brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah prospered in all his works. Probably some of the thinking behind that is, hey, worst case scenario, if we're involved in war, and one thing that will be done is to shut off water supplies, and you have this underground water tunnel that's coming in that my understanding is still there in Jerusalem today. And so just in case, this is a protection against enemy forces. Turns out being pretty handy in what takes place under his reign. But he prospers in all of his works, verse 31. However, regarding the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, whom they sent to him to inquire about the wonder that was done in the land, which one do you think that was? Another word for wonder is a sign or a miracle. What miracle had they noticed? I'm going to guess everybody noticed it. Everybody sees the lights of the sky, right? And so think about this. The miracle that God provides to Hezekiah isn't just something that Hezekiah sees. It's something in the very least that whole region, I think probably it would seem that the whole world observes. And they want to know more about this. And the God of Israel that has worked this. This is an opportunity for Hezekiah. This is wonderful. These ambassadors come and, hey, tell us more about this sign that was worked starting in your land. And here's what Hezekiah does. Oh, you want to see my land? Well, look at all the cars I have. Check out all my assets, my bank accounts. Here, I'll show you our military. You'll be blown away by that. Here are all the strategic points in our country. I think the issue is that Hezekiah makes this all about himself and how great he is and all of the accomplishments in his life, which makes a lot of sense. Did you notice all those pronouns as we're going through? He's doing all these things for whom? Not for God, not for his people. It's for himself. He's absorbed by himself. Joe? Excellent, Joe. And I think that differentiation is also made probably in the Bible, and that it's stated that Hezekiah was the greatest of all the kings of Judah. Not all the kings of Israel and Judah. Yeah, that's reserved, humanly speaking, for one. I'm pretty confident. Yeah, very good, Joe. I think you're right. There seems to be more selflessness on the part of David probably than... But granted, understand also, this is later in his reign when his faithfulness is really waning. David has some rough times in the latter portion too. Yeah, thank you for that, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. Good, Joe. So we've already done this in our Luke class. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but compare Hezekiah's life to that of the rich fool in the parable in Luke 12, 15 through 21. I think there's a strong chance Hezekiah is the guy. If not, it fits it to a T. Here you've done all these things for yourself. I'll pull down my barns and I'll build greater, and for myself and self you have many goods laid up for many years. God says to him, you're a fool because tonight you're going to die. And what's going to happen with all of these things? Could Hezekiah and his life. Let's go ahead and move forward though. Verse 32, now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and his goodness, indeed they are written in the vision of the prophet at the time, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, and in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. So Hezekiah rested with his fathers, and they buried him in the upper tombs of the sons of David, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem honored him at his death. Then Manasseh his son reigned in his place. And this brings us to a new conversation in Judah's history. This last section, we were struggling to hang on to our freedom in the country. What kind of a king is Hezekiah's son Manasseh? What will he be? You think so? Well, I hope not. I hope not. Hezekiah, the greatest of the kings of the divided kingdom in the south of Judah, and for that matter, Israel as far as the divided kingdom period. But his dad, Hezekiah's dad, Ahaz, sounds a lot like Ahab, and that's not good. Well, Manasseh doesn't sound a lot like Ahab or Hezekiah, but he's going to act a whole lot like Ahab. And sadly, the country's independence is going to be lost in this stretch of text that we're going to be considering. So let's look. We're going to skip now to 2 Kings 21. Remember, keep your place if you want. And 2 Chronicles will be 33 as we go back. But 2 Kings chapter 21 is where we're going to spend most of our time in our new study this morning. First verse, 2 Kings 21. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. We've had this conversation. If you want to have a young person in your household who just thrives, does great in life, probably the best thing you can do for him or her when the child turns 16 years old is to toss the keys of a brand new BMW into his or her hands, right? That's going to work really well. We don't do that. Why do we not do that? Now, we'll start at 16. You can drive, but it typically is a little more of a clunker, right? In your first, why do you do that? Well, a couple things. One, you need to grow into and you need to learn to appreciate, right? And, you make up your own mind. I think there's some good in a child paying at least even a part of the first vehicle that he or she owns and other things like that to really be able to appreciate what it is to make things go in life. Well, just imagine when you're 16, you get handed the keys to a brand new shiny, not Beamer, but a kingdom, a whole nation. And then think that 4 years before that is actually when you get the keys to the kingdom. You're not even a teenager yet. Well, that puts a child in a difficult spot to succeed in life, doesn't it? Manasseh is only 12 years old when he has the keys of the kingdom thrown to him. And he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem, in part because he's so young when he takes over. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. The years here with which we're dealing are 697 to 642 BC. 697 to 642 BC that Manasseh is going to reign over Judah. So we're right at the turn of the century when he takes over. What kind of a king is he? Oh, I wish you would have been wrong, Roy, but he's right. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had finally, after all these years, destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal and made a wooden image as Ahab. Remember, Ahaz sounds a lot like Ahab. That's not good. Manasseh doesn't sound like Ahab, but unfortunately he acts just like him. He made a wooden image, raised up altars for Baal as Ahab, king of Israel, had done, and he worshipped all the host of heaven and served him. It's like many of the pagans, and you see all over the world in ancient times, people will notice, oh, the sun, that's quite an impressive light in the sky, and the moon, hey, let's worship them, all right. And the same thing with the stars and all the wandering stars. Look back in 2 Kings chapter 11. We're digressing. There had been quite a bit of progress up to this point, thanks in large part to a king like Hezekiah, but there have been some others through the years like Josiah back in this stretch. 2 Kings chapter 11. Read with me in verse 18. Then all the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars, my page keeps flipping, there we go. His altars and his images they broke in pieces, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars, and the priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. And this is, we're looking, give or take, 100 years prior. And now here we are, and you think so much more progress. No, Manasseh rebuilds all these things that the people correctly had torn down just so Yahweh could be worshipped. He's serving all of these false gods. Verse 4 of 2 Kings 21. He also, speaking of Manasseh, built altars in the house of the Lord. Disrespect. Of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. So not only is he worshiping these false gods, but he's worshiping Baal and the female counterpart, Asherah or the Asherim. And he's worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars in the house where Yahweh is to be worshipped. Also, verse 6, he made his son pass through the fire. He sacrificed his own child in worship to gods that don't even exist. Practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spiritists and mediums. I'm going to switch over to this at this point. It's because there are a lot of synonyms. These words, it's difficult if you look them up to find the difference in meaning between them. So I want to read to you from the contemporary English version right here. Manasseh practiced magic and witchcraft. He asked fortune tellers for advice and sacrificed his own son. He did many sinful things and made the Lord very angry. So as far as the magic and the witchcraft go, he's inciting the devil for help in the things that he's doing. He was a very superstitious man. He would ask fortune tellers for advice, and he would try to read the stars to tell him what it was that needed to take place in his life, instead of just talking to the Lord and asking him for advice. So he did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. He even carved an image of Asherah, and that's going to be the opposite of Baal. The plural would be Asherim, that he had made in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers." Here's all they have to do. Only if they are careful to do according to all that I've commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they paid no attention. And Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. And the Lord spoke by his servants, the prophets, saying, "Because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations," listen to this, "he has acted more wickedly than all the Amorites who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols." Now, we keep seeing these statements, especially with the kings of Israel, and the nation of Israel is gone by this point in the northern regions of it. But we keep finding these statements that, he was the worst and did more evil than all the kings who were before him. But those are relative statements compared to the righteous, quote unquote. This one's different. You remember how depraved the people of the land of Canaan were when God finally says, after 400 years after he gave his warning, "I'm done," they're going to be wiped out. Awful, terrible people. Manasseh was so bad. He was worse than the initial people that God kicked out of the land of Canaan so that the children of Israel could come in and take it over. How's that even possible? How could the religious, righteous seed ever get to such a point? Verse 12, "Therefore thus says the Lord God of Israel, Behold, I am bringing such calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria, and the plummets," or you might have the plumb line, we might say like the chalk line, something along those lines, "of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down." So when he says, "I will stretch over Jerusalem, the measuring line of Samaria," the former capital city of the northern kingdom Israel, "and the plumb line of the house of Ahab," what's happened to Israel and what's happened to the house of Ahab? Let's deal specifically. The house of Ahab, what takes place, requires a few years, but God made a promise, and he did this with many dynasties or potential dynasties up in the north. They were absolutely crushed, John. All of the potential rulers, all the kids, every one of them eventually executed. There's nothing left of those families. All right, so what's happened recently with Israel? The Assyrians came in. They carried them all away captive, right? Killed many of them, imprisoned them, made them slaves. They repositioned them in other portions of the Assyrian Empire. And so what God is saying is, I'm going to make what happened to Israel happen to Judah. I'm going to make what happened among the rulers, what happened to the rulers or what will happen to the rulers of Judah. And I like this example here. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Okay, so let's think about this. You have a dish, and you make some delicious accommodation that you put inside of that dish. I recently made zucchini spaghetti, zucchini lasagna is what I made. Delicious stuff, all right? And I have this dish, and I have it out for the purpose of I'm using it. I'm accomplishing something. But then it comes time to clean up that messy dish, and it is, after zucchini lasagna. Nevertheless, you put it in the dishwasher, rinse it out really well first, put it in the dishwasher, and it comes out, it's done. It didn't get perfectly dried. So you pick it up, and you wipe, if you do dishes correctly, you're going to wipe the inside first, right? And then you'll turn it over, and you'll wipe the outside. And then what do you do with the dish? What do you do with the dish at that point? You put it away. Whether that's in the upper cabinet, or with us, it's a lower cabinet on the Lazy Susan. Love that Lazy Susan. And we'll put it in there, you put it up, and you close the cabinet door. And how much attention does that dish get then? None. Until and if you want to use it again. Do you see what God's saying here with Jerusalem? He says, I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to wipe it on the inside, flip it over, wipe it on the outside, and then I'm going to put it up on the shelf. And I'm going to close the cabinet door. And I will only mess with that dish again if I decide that I want to use it again. So this is what Jerusalem has coming to her. Verse 14, so I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become victims of plunder to all their enemies, because they have done evil in my sight. This isn't God just being mean-spirited here. God does not have a mean-spirited bone in his body. The only time that quote-unquote negative things come to anyone is in connection either to the negative decisions those people have made or other people have made that sometimes are consequences that do get passed along. He says, I'm only doing this because it's just punishment that is deserved. And we can know that God is just because he's handling his own people just like he had handled those who were not his people. He says, they have provoked me to anger since the day the fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. We're about the year 700 BC, well into it by this point, and the exodus from Egypt takes place right around 1450 BC. The 750 years, almost a millennium. He says it's been the same song, just a different verse, over and over. So now I'm going to give them what they deserve. Verse 16, moreover, I'd say this probably had something to do with God's decision. Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides his sin, by which he had made Judah sin, in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. When we're talking about innocent blood being shed, this could be on all different paradigms. It appears it especially would have to do with the prophets of God probably being executed, who would speak against the king and the king's ways. In fact, there is an ancient tradition that it's on Manasseh's watch that a very great prophet of the Lord is executed at his hand. Any guesses who that would be? Remember the prophet who was working with Dad, Hezekiah? The Messianic prophet, Isaiah himself. I want to read, you can turn if you want, you don't have to, but I want to read from Hebrews chapter 11, and this may be the allusion. So as you're going to Hebrews 11, I'll mention this. The ancient tradition concerning Isaiah is that he was inside of a hollow tree, hiding, trying to preserve his life, and he was found in that place, and then the king had, through his officers, ordered for that tree to be cut down and sawn, and in the process, the man, Isaiah the prophet, was sawn in half. Now again, that's not in Scripture, but that's an ancient tradition. Let me read to you from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35, talking about the faithful of old. Middle of verse 35, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. We don't know of anyone with whom that happened in the Bible, but we do have the tradition that it was Isaiah, and that may be the reference right here to the man of God. Regardless of who it is, he's guilty of shedding innocent blood. God's not going to tolerate that. Jerusalem's been filled with clean blood from one end to the other. We're told in verse 17, now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, all that he did, the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? They certainly are, and we'll go to and we'll read that. I do want to mention to you just one more historical note before we cross over to 2 Chronicles 33, where we'll close. We're told that, so this comes from James Smith's commentary. He says, the Assyrian annals, so again, this isn't scripture, but this is what's recorded in Assyrian history that would inscribe on these columns. There's the Sennacherib prism and others where the details are still found today, preserved. The Assyrian annals, Mr. Smith says, add one detail about the reign of Manasseh. He is mentioned as a faithful vassal of Esarhaddon, and that's the king after Sennacherib of the Assyrian Empire. So he's a good buddy of this Assyrian king, Manasseh is. He even contributed troops for the great king, as in Esarhaddon, of the great king's invasion of Egypt in 669 BC. So it appears that they're military allies with one another. The allusion's been made to 2 Chronicles, so let's go back to that place where we're going to close. 2 Chronicles chapter 33. We were in 32 earlier. Now we're in 33. And in verses 1 through 8, you're going to find basically just a restatement of everything we discussed. So I'm not going to go back and to read all of that, but you're welcome to review that if you would like on your own. What I do want to read, though, is verse 9 of 2 Chronicles 33. I only ask that you read it from your mind. What is 2 Chronicles 33:9? What does that say? Good. And we had this already in the parallel of it, and we had some discussion on it. But here's the restatement of it. How sad is that? As bad as the Canaanites were, and God puts up with them for half a millennium, even when they're completely rotten, and finally it gets so bad he just expels them, tells the Israelites, listen, this is righteous judgment. They're all exterminated. Don't let any of them survive. You don't want that among you. Israel doesn't listen, and she shows some mercy and lets them survive. Oh, that would be awful. Even though God says, this is right, this is a judicial sentence from heaven, they don't do it. And what do you know? They end up with that influence among them, and you fast forward 700 years, and they're just as, in fact, they're even more rotten than what the Canaanites originally were, worshiping the same gods, practicing the same immoral activities. Listen, God always knows best. The only time when we are fools is when we question His judgment and we don't put into practice what it is He tells us to do. The failure to obey on the part of the Israelites turns out to be their own demise, just as the nations who are before them. We're going to close with this, verse number 10. And the Lord, through this span, spoke to Manasseh and his people. Now, why would He do that? He's the righteous judge of heaven. Manasseh's a mess. Jerusalem's a mess. The whole country is a complete disaster. So why wouldn't He just give them what they deserve? He's the righteous, just judge. But He's also an ever-loving God who's not willing or desirous that a single person should have to die. But He wants every soul in the world to come to repentance. So year after year, decade after decade, in the case of Israel, century after century, in His seemingly infinite patience, He keeps pleading, sending more and more prophets. Come back to me. We can have a better life. We can have a tremendous relationship again together. And what does the king do with these innocent prophets, with the innocent message who are coming to him? It would appear he kills them one after another, probably including, arguably, the greatest Old Testament prophet that ever lived, and Isaiah are at least among them. The Lord kept speaking to the king because He doesn't even want Manasseh to lose his life. He doesn't want this kingdom to be lost for the people, for their families. But they would not listen. Remember the lesson that we take from this in 2 Peter 3. When God makes a promise about potential punishment for sin, he's not slow to fulfill his promise, as some men would count slowness. But what it is that he is long-suffering, patient. Again, not willing that a single person would perish, but that all would come to repentance. But beloved, Peter goes on to say, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. Don't think, as Peter says, people would make the mistake in doing, when God has promised judgment on the sinful world, that just because it hasn't happened after a year, 10 years, 100 years, by this point, 2,000 years, that means that it's never going to happen. And don't get confused and think that the seemingly infinite patience of God actually is infinite. There is an end to the patience of God. And he says, understand this, the day of the Lord, speaking on judgment on the world, will eventually come. And when it happens, it's not going to be slow. It's going to be fast. Like a thief in the night. Paul describes it as a blink of an eye when it's all going to take place. And this place is going to be completely leveled. So understanding that, he says, what manner of people ought you to be in holy conduct and in judgment, looking forward to and anticipating the great day of God. God keeps sending his prophets to Manasseh and to Judah. Come on, guys, let's get this in order. They start to take it for granted. They treat them however they want and think, oh, this is just going to happen forever then, like this. It's not going to work that way. They do not listen. The great downfall of humanity when we struggle to listen to God. Adam and Eve had a little problem, didn't they? They started out listening, and then they got to where, well, they weren't listening quite as closely to what God had said. How did that turn out for them? They die, and they bring death into the world for every one of us because they didn't listen to God. The people in the days of Noah, they stopped listening to God. God was very patient. For another 120 years, Genesis 6:3 says, he keeps sending them messages through his preacher, Noah, and his family. They don't listen. After 120 years, what happens? The whole world is destroyed. The Israelites came out of Egypt. They start listening to God, and just right off the bat, they stop listening to God. How does that turn out for them? They don't get to enter the rest of God found in the glorious promised land of Canaan, not that generation. Are we listening to God when he's talking to us? Do we take for granted, well, I heard it last week, and I'm hearing it today, and I'll hear it next week, and the week after that, and the week after that? The seemingly infinite patience of God eventually wears thin. Are we listening to him? Are we learning from the pages of history? When people haven't listened to God, it doesn't turn out well for them. What about for Manasseh and Judah? And they're not listening to God. How's it going to turn out for them? We'll discuss next week in the remainder of 2 Chronicles 33. Any other comments, though, about today's study? The end of Hezekiah's life, and then a good chunk of Manasseh's and the sins that he's committed. Yes, sir. 55 years. Took over at 12, so he would have been roughly 67. Well, he passed a long time. Why would he do that? Because normally he only does that. Normally, that'd work. Normally, he only does that with really good kings. So why would he do it with the most evil king, who was the longest reign? Might have something to do with our discussion next week. Great point, John.
I also think of the bloodline.
Oh, good point. Yeah, good point. So for those who might not have heard John saying, he prayed, Hezekiah did, for his life to be extended. In part, he doesn't even have a male heir right then. If he had known what his son would have become, might he have changed his mind about the extended days? That could be. Hadn't thought about that, John. All right, thank you. So for next time, please read the remainder of 2 Chronicles 33. Please also read the remainder of 2 Kings 21. We'll use both of those. Our memory verse will be 2 Chronicles 33:13. 2 Chronicles 33:13. Can a leopard change its spots? We'll find out next week. Thank you.